Hi. So we're here from the Student Privacy Initiative at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, as well as from HarvardX. And we just thought that it would be nice to talk about student privacy and ed tech for an hour. So we hope that that's what you are all here to talk about too. We thought we'd start things off with a quick interactive quiz. So if you have an internet-enabled device, if you could get that out, that would be great. So if you just click on this link, or sorry, write it into your computer, sorry, and then underneath the student join room, if you just put in LASI 2014 and click go.
Yeah, that was not correct. But I'm glad it was just restaurant supplies and nothing else. Right. Is everybody getting it okay?
Yeah.
You should start the quiz.
Or serve it in the quiz.
Serve it.
Can't do it wrong.
I'll help you.
And it's all anonymous also.
Well, thank you very much for completing that, and we're going to go through now and take a look together at the information that you shared. So it will guide our discussion together for the next 15 minutes or so. So first, in your practice as an educator, what ed tech tools do you use with your students? So we have a range here. Computers, tablets, some learning management system statistical software, YouTube, Google, Edmodo, Khan Academy, some big names on here. 5-question tool, so a lot of folks who are going to be familiar with what we're doing right now. Gmail. SurveyMonkey, not an educator, fair enough. Reddit, okay. That's great. So there's a real, range of different tools that folks are having their students work with. When you use the EdTech product, you read with privacy policy, true or false? Oh, is it not?
That's about right.
Is that? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for the honesty. And can you hear me now?
No, 19% of people were not honest.
Thank you to 81% of people who are honest. The 19% of you who are not do not get dessert. So Justin, do you want to expand on your observation there about the 19% of our friends?
I actually believe it's 1 out of 5 people in factory for privacy policies are the things they observe.
But Justin's broader point is well taken, that we know from research, from anecdata, and quite frankly just from our own personal experiences, sure just in our personal lives, not in our professional, that sometimes it is very hard to make your way through those layer upon layer, very dense, difficult, long privacy policies. It just is. And we know from a recent survey of a representative sample of K-12 school districts around the country that was done down by Fordham in late December, that the percentage of K-12 school districts, which is what the Berkman Student Privacy Initiative, where I'm coming from, is focused on, that a lot of folks there are also, as a general rule, not so much getting all the way through these privacy policies. And I'm not casting blame or tisk-tisking in any way. Again, these privacy policies can be long, convoluted, and dense, and especially for classroom educators on the front lines trying to plan a lesson for tomorrow as they're grading yesterday's assignments, it can be very difficult to see exactly what Google or Facebook or Khan Academy or any one of the tools that was listed on the previous screen is telling you that they will or won't do with your students' data.
But most of them have the, and we can change this at any time without your consent, so why bother?
So this is another big part of it, right? That is this sort of Alice in Wonderland, ever-shifting terrain, that even if you nail it down that moment, what you're getting is a snapshot. So we can change this. We may reshare with certain third parties that only we know about. Good luck then figuring out what those third-party policies are. So exactly, you've identified another source of frustration and confusion that a lot of educators, and quite frankly any of us who use any of these websites or similar ones in our personal lives, which I imagine is everyone feels. So that's exactly right. And we'll talk more through the course of this discussion about what are some things that can be done about the difficulty of parsing through privacy policies, and what are some things that school districts and educators can be thinking about. Okay, my level of concern about student privacy when it comes to ed tech is low, 26%, moderate, 48%, and high, 26%. Justin, how many are one?
I would love to hear from one person who has a low level of concern and one person has a high level of concern, sort of some of the things that characterize their positions there. Wishy-washy people in the middle we don't need to hear from. All right, but anybody?
Yeah.
So I have a high level of concern, and part of my concern is around as we develop these systems that become dependent and responsive to student data. Like, I'm curious about, like, what does it mean, like, even if you give an affordance inside of the system to opt out and say, I want my data to be anonymized or private, or don't collect on me, give me some anonymous behavior, or disconnected from the system, am I going to put myself at a learning disadvantage? So is it going to become a situation of if I want to have a positive learning experience in the system and the structure. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Because we have also the audience which is watching us.
Right.
The live stream, so please.
So my concern is really around, as we build systems that become adaptive and responsive to student data, what does it mean to even give them options to give privacy and opt out of data collection? If the affordance is there, are they going to put themselves at a learning disadvantage? So even if someone thinks that to the degree that I might not want people to be collecting on me, what's the choice then? Is the choice a diminished learning experience for that privacy?
Yeah, and you're proposing a pretty high level of autonomy for an individual. I mean, most of our students are in circumstances where they don't feel autonomous, where they feel compelled to make decisions because their teacher asked them to do something, because it's required for a program, because their school district told them to do it. So yeah, the situation is concerning enough if we could believe the fiction that students have real autonomy. It is maybe even more concerning if they don't. Anybody want to make the case for sort of low levels of concern about student privacy?
I answer no because I don't think the students care too much about this. Maybe it's my experience, my personal experience. They know that the university is collecting a lot of data about them. And they know that it's used for some purposes, but they don't really pay much attention to this. I don't think that, at least at the beginning for the research part, that could be a problem. Maybe when it's institutionalized, when things like evaluation is linked to this data, then there will be problems. But right now, it's just a game.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I hear there's sort of two things baked in there which can probably be disassociated. One of which is that students expect that educators collect data about them and use that data to inform and improve their experience. Like any teacher who's not doing that in some way, shape, or form, we're quite concerned about that teacher. We expect them to be using data to improve instruction. And another part of that is our students, for the most part, are growing up in circumstances where they know that large corporations are amassing enormous dossiers about them, and what these kind of rinky-dink universities can do to collect and contribute to that is probably relatively minor compared to what the Googles and Facebooks and NSAs of the world know about them. And so there certainly is, there's both the kind of realism in there and a kind of hopeless angst of like, well, they know everything now. What does it matter if they know, how many math problems I got right when I was playing with Khan Academy or something like that.
I just want to say that in this audience, there's a mix of people that do K-12 and university, and I was responding more from a K-12 perspective, especially elementary students, where I'm on the high side. I just want to make sure that the diversity of the audience recognizes that you could disaggregate.
Yeah, we're aware of that and actually picked panelists accordingly. So the Student Privacy Initiative at Berkman, where I'm coming over from, has been focused on K-12, and Justin here has extensive expertise in the higher ed realm. So when you we will try to pinpoint, but as a shorthand, if I'm saying it, odds are it's kind of coming from a K-12 use case, and Justin is more higher ed.
I just want to, the issue about students know, elementary is not true. And so that's part of the education process for them. So.
Right, and students at the elementary school level, of course, their rights that exist under federal and state law to give consent or opt out of certain data collection are rights that belong to the parents, or in certain circumstances may belong, can get once students hit 18, they go to them. But as a general rule, you're talking about parents having decision-making authority for students. So there's a whole other level of remove there. And what we have seen, and again, we'll continue to talk about this through the course of this discussion, but you bring up an excellent point, which is, and to take it even one step further, not only do I think students don't know, but parents often don't know, because under what's happening a lot right now is that schools and districts in the K-12 space, as they start using more and more cloud-based, in particular, educational technologies, they are relying on a certain legal framework to say we don't need to get parental consent to use some of these technologies. We may have to tell parents that we're doing it, but we actually can go ahead and make these decisions essentially by putting ourselves in the parent's shoes. And I'll break that out more. I should say also, I am a lawyer. In addition to my work at Berkman, I'm an associate professor at University of New Hampshire School of Law, so I bring the law hat to it. And I used to practice education law. So we'll unpack that more, but your points are very well taken.
So around a year ago, I had a very interesting experiment where I wanted to capture expert-novice interactions as remediations for other students. We did this experiment very carefully in an MIT classroom where we were recording as we were helping students. This was one of many desks where they could get help, only one was being recorded. We had nice sheets that described everything, how we would use the data, consent forms. I mean, we crossed every I, dotted every T. Of the forms that describe what we would do with the data, 0 were picked up by students. But we tried to give out a consent form that explained what was on the consent form. Every single time students would cut us off, sign it, hand it back. 0 of the students actually cared. 0. And this was an MIT audience, students who are very tech savvy. So there's a change coming in the generation, and it's something we're going to have to manage in some way. The researchers, we decided, were much more concerned about student privacy than the very savvy students themselves.
Yes, I think there are 2 points there. One is that I think we have a research infrastructure which is built around gaining people's consent, and there's all kinds of research that suggests that the consent process just doesn't work. It particularly doesn't work well with things like terms of service and privacy policies, where we can assume that people don't read things. But also in the kinds of situations that you describe, like even if you sit down with people and try to read them a document which says, I'm going to explain to you the ways in which we're going to use this data, people who don't come from a context where they would understand research just wouldn't have that context. And it sounds like your point also is that they just did, even if they did, they didn't want to hear it.
They just didn't care.
I do think that in a second point there is in an educational context is a really great question to ask. So should we accommodate students who take that kind of position towards their student data? Or should we say, geez, that's super problematic. Like the students at MIT of all places should be really concerned about that. And we should be designing the systems that we use to inform people about the ways that they use their data to try to get them to care more about the use of their data, which may very well have the effect of having them not want to share their data as much with us. But do we have a kind of educative responsibility to do some of that?
2 points. So based on what you're talking about now, students don't care. I think that in the educational process, there is an element of trust and confidence of the student towards the tutor. So it's not that students don't care, it's just that they trust the teacher to actually, do what they're saying and use the data accordingly. And on voting for no, I think that in an educational context, you'd expect the students and their behaviors and interactions to actually be on topic. So you wouldn't really expect them to be sharing any personal stuff on the LMS. So I'm not really concerned about their data. That's fine.
Yeah, I guess I would echo that. I also think it's a trust, an implicit trust. When you come and you say I'm from MITx, they say, oh, okay, well, I know that they're not going to sell my data to Coca-Cola, and there's litigation that I can go to if I need to, that you wouldn't have gotten IRB approval if you said, by the way, we're going to sell your data to Coca-Cola. And so it's not that they don't necessarily care, but there is a power relationship and a trust relationship there. I think that is playing into that decision.
So I'd like to add to this the question about what's the reasonable expectation to privacy in these circumstances. That seems, if you go to a shopping mall, you can be photographed because you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy. What's the condition of that with respect to these kinds of data collection operations?
And how does that interact with technological change so that you have a reasonable expectation that at this moment your data will be collected using technologies that we're sort of aware of and used using algorithms and systems that we're sort of aware of, but if the data is sort of kept in permanent ways, then it's sort of impossible to have a reasonable expectation of what might happen in the future with that data, because we don't know what technologies that will emerge. We don't know what sort of new possibilities there are for merging different kinds of data sets, collecting different kinds of data sets that make the data that appear harmless in one context become easily re-identifiable, become consequential for students' life experiences later on. But I think that whole, one theme that comes up, which is, I think is a really important theme for all of us to think about, is the idea that students have an enormous amount of trust for us, and they have some kind of reasonable expectations that that data will be collected and used. That's part of the educational process inherently. So protecting that trust seems to me to be, proactively protecting that trust seems to be a sort of central consideration for the world that we live in, especially today. Kind of, and I'm sure people are reading the reverberations of the Facebook emotional contagion study, and other kinds of things like that, which should weigh heavily on us. I wonder if we should go on to Leah.
Maybe I was just going to say very, very briefly, we can get on to the next one. I think that students' trust in educators is certainly warranted. What concerns me right now, again thinking about the K-12 space in particular here, is that we know a lot of districts are very under-resourced, not saying that's their fault at all, but they're under-resourced, and so you have, and again, a national representative sample that Fordham looked at about 6 months ago. You had about 20% of school districts in the sample that didn't even have any IT policies in place, right? And so it's not that these are folks who are not worthy of their students' trust and not doing their best to continue to be worthy of it. It's that they haven't yet had the resources or the bandwidth to come up with a framework to assess, okay, so if we are using this third-party tech provider, whether it's for administrative purposes or classroom experiences or both, what exactly is this third-party provider going to be doing with this data? If they're telling us that they're not resharing it, or they're only resharing it if it's de-identified, but a lot of districts, again, lacking policies, lacking a CIO, CTO, or CPO who can go through this, if there's even a contract at all, right? It's unclear exactly where that data is going to go and what's going to be done with it as it gets further down this kind of rabbit hole. So I guess this is why, in response to folks who are saying that level of concern is low because there's a culture of trust in educational institutions. I'm an educator, I'm an administrator, I was a student not that long ago, so I firmly believe that is the dominant culture, but I think through no fault of the folks who inhabit that space, and I'm not saying any fault of the folks who are inhabiting the tech entrepreneurial space, who I think are often educators and coming into this space with the absolute best of intentions. But as Justin said, it's complicated, it's evolving quickly. Part of the value for a tech startup is getting this data and then being able to use it for different purposes as new iterations emerge. And so there's just a lot of murkiness, I think, in this rapidly evolving space that doesn't necessarily mean we can't rely on this culture of trust. What's that movie, The Circle of Trust, the Robert De Niro movie? Anyway. Meet the Fockers, that's what it is. So I actually mean culture of trust, like for real. I keep saying that, I'm hearing myself, like that can't be right, but culture of trust, but simply that all of us who are participating in learning environments as educators, administrators, researchers, students, parents, etc., need some more education and more conversations just like these. So why don't we move on to the next question and then we can keep the discussion going. If I have any concerns about student privacy, my concerns are, okay. We've talked about some of these. Protection for their future, not identifying. Data leakage, yes, very real. Student privacy compromised. Data being exposed, greater for younger students. Negative impact on assessment. So as we're scrolling through here, I'm seeing concerns that I might broadly lump into kind of privacy 1.0 and privacy 2.0. concerns, all of which are very valid and very real and merit further discussion and unpacking. Privacy 1.0, I would put in that category sort of this fundamental data security. How is data transferred? How is it stored? If it's reshared, is it actually de-identified? And I know you know more about that than I do. So keeping it just secure and figuring out who has it, why they have it, did they get the appropriate consent, and what can they do with it? So these very concrete, pragmatic questions, and I think that the ed tech / student privacy field is still largely in this 1.0 space. We're all still trying to nail down what exactly is happening in these very structural ways. But 2.0 concerns, which I think, again, just as real, just as valid, but a little bit harder to talk about in a meaningful way just yet because we're still nailing down 1.0, have to do with, okay, so let's say we have someone who the data's secure, this researcher, this administrator, this teacher has every legal right in the world to have it. What is sort of the principles that are underlying their use of it? So for instance, if you say, okay, I'm going to get data on students from pre-K to 12, in grade 12, in this district, and we're going to follow them, and we're going to be able to predict, based on how long it takes them to click through an ebook, right? What their reading comprehension level is going to be from the time they're 3. I don't know. Probably 5. I have a 3.5-year-old, and while he actually does know how to use the iPad, I don't think he's reading anything on it yet. And then all of a sudden, we're tracking those students, and we're saying, well, Johnny's not going to do so well at reading, so why don't we make sure Johnny takes shop class, in 6th grade instead of Shakespearean English. And before you know it, you have this sort of big brother type setup where, again, back to this culture of trust, best of intentions, trying to put Johnny on the best course possible, and poor Johnny has just been tracked from the time he's 3 to 5 years old. And so that's kind of what I'd say privacy 2.0, that's some of what I'm seeing up here. How long does the data persist? What is it being used for? That kind of potential for data to follow students, and even with the best of intentions of data analysts, pigeonhole students, discriminate against students, or make students feel like there isn't room for epiphanies, for chance meetings and everything to shape their future. That's kind of privacy 2.0. I'm sure you have thoughts about these too, Justin. Maybe we had
So another thing that came up last year was people, particularly third-party people, taking this data, making algorithms, patenting those algorithms, and making money off of the students that are donating this data for free and have no idea that this is happening to them and are not benefiting in any way, and the teachers either, the schools are not. So that's another layer. I think it's a privacy 2.0.
Yeah, I think that's privacy 2.0, but again, that's very important. And the New York Times reported back in October of 2013, I believe it was, that educational software, so broadly construed here, not necessarily cloud specific, although a lot of these products are involved with cloud, is an $8 billion a year industry. And I was reading on Twitter, I want to say this morning, that some of the, what was the statistic, the funding for ed tech, this past quarter was down to just $327 million, $100 million, right? That's not, that's not down. And so with students, you do have essentially a captive market. States all are going to have compulsory attendance laws, and so students, unless they're homeschooled or have certain other very narrow circumstances, they have to go to school. Their parents are legally required to send them. The parents can be fined or sometimes incarcerated. Texas likes to do that if you don't send your kids to school. And so you are serving up a captive market. So I agree with you, that falls into privacy 2.0 bucket.
On to the next question.
Why not?
You told us to use it.
Culture of trust.
It wasn't there.
Where was it?
Sorry?
Where was it? I found it.
It seems really obvious, but that was a time constraint, and maybe those time constraints also are reasons why we don't read the other terms of service.
Time constraints, culture of trust, also is,
It's not offered to you?
not easily offered, and also the dynamic where even though we are all adults and all peers here, some sense of, oh, the people in the front of the room are asking us to do this, so it feels awkward to raise my hand to say, wait a second, I actually don't want to click on the link until you have given me a little bit more time.
It's completely anonymous. There is no sense in which this company can enforce a contract against me if it doesn't know whether I participated.
Your IP? Completely anonymous?
And it's also the
President.
knows who I am.
Just very much, I did find their privacy policy in their terms of use. There's 8,800 words in their terms of use and about 1,900 in their privacy policy, which if you read it 200 words per minute would take you 50 minutes. So nobody read the terms before I signed them.
Thank you.
Hey, weren't we honest?
What?
Weren't we honest?
Yes, no, you all get dessert.
I didn't read it because I didn't care what was in it. And I think that there's other people, I hope, in the room who also didn't care what's in it, because we just figured, there's nothing they can do, and there's nothing they could put in there that would actually matter.
You've just given away your dessert for the next week.
Well, along those lines, there's often, as a user, nothing we can do. There's no opt-out option. We either use the tool and agree to share everything, or we don't use the tool. And until there's an opt-out option, it really doesn't matter.
It's a contract of adhesion, essentially, right? That kind of click-through. You're opting in, or you're not using it at all, in which case you miss out on the shared experience. You miss out on giving us and everyone else in the room your valuable input.
Oh, nice. I'll buy a used car from you.
Sorry?
I'll buy a used car from you.
So, I think that's all the questions we have.
Okay.
We've got a question over here.
Oh, yes.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. There is a very nice plugin for Firefox called TOSDR, Terms of Service Didn't Read, that if you enter in a social web, shows something related to the terms of service. Unfortunately, there is no entry for Socrative, but if you go to Facebook or whatever and you are uploading a video, it warns you, beware, because this site is given to third-party people and so on.
So TOSDR sort of takes a bunch of common features of privacy policy, kind of color codes them based on their, how agreeable they are to their vision of what a high-quality privacy policy would look like. It tries to provide, essentially visual summary data about the quality of a privacy policy, which I think is a great enterprise. There's one named Audrey Waters who has a blog called Hack Education. We've been hoping that educators would come together and write the sort of TOSDR for EdTech products.
So some of this we've already touched on over the course of our initial discussion, but basically what you see up here is a snapshot of just some of the many, many tools that you're seeing. Again, I'm focused on the K-12 space here. And these tools are compelling because they offer schools and districts a lot of efficiencies. Budgets are tight. Often there can be cost savings. They're also compelling for very positive reasons, that we are trying to raise children who will go on to excel in higher education and in the workplace in the 21st century, and being tech literate, if not tech savvy, is crucial. So, a lot of compelling reasons here why the data that is generated by EdTech is valuable for teachers, administrators, researchers, parents, children, in addition to the fact that for the classroom products, there's value in having students of any age, within appropriate constraints, figuring out how to use these products. Although I will add, kind of following on the discussion we just had, I think how to use those products responsibly, right? And maybe in future years, some of the classes will involve, the same way you tell students not to talk to strangers. If some person you've never met before is up at the front of the room and says, click on this link and give me some information, you have to, not take the candy, so to speak. So this is, again, just a snapshot of some of the different products that folks are using. So again, this is sort of the positive column over here on the left, some of the things I just talked about. Over here in our concern column, we are focused here on what I was talking earlier, those privacy 1.0 concerns. So just to give you a very, very brief, and I promise I am a law professor, but I'll be brief, what those acronyms mean, FERPA, COPA, and PPRA. Just quick show of hands. You don't have to log into Socratic unless you want to, but quick show of hands, who knows what those acronyms stand for?
Who knows some of them?
That counts. One or more acronyms. Okay, this is great, so I'll make it super quick. So FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. COPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. I always stumble over those two, but thank you. And then PPRA, which may be the least familiar acronym up there, Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment. Those are all federal laws that were not passed with EdTech specifically in mind, but apply to one or more players in the K-12 EdTech space. I'm stressing K-12 here because COPA is not going to apply if you are in a space where your users are older than 13 or older. So starting with FERPA very quickly, FERPA is the law that says when you are sharing personally identifiable information from education records, as a general rule, you need the consent of the parent for a minor or the student if you're talking about somebody who's attained the age of majority. There are exceptions to that. The exception that surfaces most often in the ed tech space is the legitimate school official exception. So what that is schools can say, okay, we are having a third-party provider, and this, by the way, covers not just ed tech providers, but a school that's working with a lawyer or a consultant, flesh and blood people. We are going to this person or this service for something that would otherwise be done in-house. This person or this service is under our direct control, and the person or service is not going to reshare the information. In other words, it gives schools a way to extend the reach of their services. If a school is engaged in information sharing that falls into the school official exception, then the school does not need to get consent, either from the parent or the adult student, ahead of time. And what we're seeing is that a lot of actors in the K-12 space on the education side, to the extent that they are thinking all of these steps through, which, and again, I mean this with complete respect, I'm an educator myself, it's not always clear that especially folks on the front lines just have the time or the bandwidth to think it through, but to the extent they're thinking it through, the school official exception to FERPA is the one that they are usually hanging their hat on when they're not going out and getting parental consent. Now, that starts to get tricky though, because as we have established, ed tech tools, be they Socrative or any one of a number of other tools that's out there, I'm not going to pick on or praise any one provider over another, I'm just using them all as examples. Those policies are, in terms of service, are going to be very long, very dense, and even when you do get through them, as you mentioned earlier, they have these little rabbit holes for, we may reshare this with third parties subject to change at any time. And so one of the things that the Student Privacy Initiative would really like to see, and this piggybacks on something actually Justin had just started to talk about, we would really like to see ed tech providers, whether as an industry-generated reform or also coming more from top down through law, regulation, or policy reform, we'd like to see essentially nutrition-style labeling for privacy policies that relate to ed tech products. Yeah? Yeah, no, jump in, please.
I was a former bilingual school teacher. I'm a literacy professor, but it just occurred to me too that a lot of these are inaccessible because families and maybe children are not yet reading in English. Or they have limited English, and I've worked with families who don't read at all.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's so important. And as someone who used to represent low-income kids and teenagers in school discipline and special ed cases, what you were saying is absolutely right and resonates very much with the experience I had as an attorney. I'll add to that, you are often talking about families that don't have access to internet in their home, they don't have access to it in the workplace, and so the idea that you're going to ask a family that's already stretched thin in terms of covering like basic life essentials like food, shelter, employment, to go to the public library, read through the, how many words was it, 8,000 plus of one of these policies, right? And then ask meaningful questions of someone who would have an answer when, quite frankly, a lot of the teachers and administrators in the district might not have answers either. That's just too many barriers. So that's, again, where this idea of more nutrition-style labeling would come in. So COPA is going to apply not to the school district itself, generally speaking, but to the ed tech providers if they are a commercial enterprise.
Well, while we're on this, if we're limited from sharing anything that's personally identifiable, how does that adapt to the changing definition of what constitutes personally identifiable? Because that used to mean taking the name off of things, but well, if you have the birthday in a hometown, that's enough, you know everything, and that the level of information that you need to re-identify somebody keeps changing.
So Justin is more expert on this than I am. I will tell you very quickly that FERPA has statutory and regulatory definitions of personally identifiable. There is a catch-all category of other information that either alone or in combination would allow a reasonable person in the school community to identify the student with reasonable certainty. Do you want to talk about that?
So Harvard and MIT have just been wrestling with this because we took a bunch of person-level summary statistics from our first year of 17 courses and de-identified them so that we could make that data set publicly accessible. So that's one of the provisions of FERPA as well, is that if you take, and this was written in 1974, if you take data and you make it anonymous, you can then release the data to anyone. What does it mean to make data anonymous? There are some, we now talk about sort of two categories of data, these identifiers, by which if you have someone's identifier, you can directly figure out who they are, and then quasi-identifiers, which are pieces of information which in combination with each other or in combination with external pieces of data could be used to re-identify someone. One of the particular challenges of the MOOCs that we were working with compared to, say, an intelligent tutor or something like that, is that we have students who write in discussion forums. And the discussion forums are archived publicly online, so we have this enormous source of data where people can write, one of the first things you do in the discussion forum is have a little thread which says, introduce yourself, write all the stuff about you. And so, if you say, hey, happy to be here from Latvia, and you're the only Latvian who's in our data set, then, whereas, releasing the fact that any of you are from the United States isn't going to make you identifiable, for that one Latvian student, it will. So we had a whole team, some of whom were lawyers at the Harvard Law School and some technologists, who got together to try to figure out, what guidance exists out there to determine how we would figure out what these kind of quasi-identifiers are. It's pretty clear from statutes and guidance that there is no set of guidance about what should be quasi-identifiers that the Department of Education is releasing. And the reason we're concerned with the Department of Education is that the bite of FERPA, which as I understand has never actually bitten anyone, is that if you receive federal funding and you're in violation of FERPA, then FERPA can take your federal funding away. I think there's a really good question at places like Harvard and MIT, are we sort of too big to FERPA? Is the federal government going to come and say, no, we're going to take away all of your federal funding? But we obviously want to be in compliance with reasonable laws. So the first thing we have to figure out are what are quasi-identifiers. And then for us, we borrowed a concept in de-identifying the data set from a professor here named LaTanya Sweeney, who's now working in the federal government, of K-anonymity, which basically says we want to make sure that every row in our data set, the combination of quasi-identifiers is in common with at least K-1 other people for any given folks. So there have to be some number of records that are identifiable. So then the next question you have to ask yourself is okay, so what's K? And once again, the Department of Education doesn't have, a brief that they sent out which says K is 7, everyone, go to it. What we based our decision on is and I may not be saying this just perfectly, but my understanding is that what we did is looked through a series of regulatory guidance statements that were made by the Department of Education, including one that basically went through the data anonymization policies across the federal government. And we settled that sort of a K=5 was somewhere in the ballpark of what other agencies seem to be doing, particularly, and even some of it was with actual K anonymity practices, but some of it is just in minimum cell sizes of tables when they're reporting data. So we're even sort of extending some of our kind of regulatory guidance from older methods of anonymity to these newer ones. So if you go to the Dataverse now and download the de-identified data set that's there from the first year of HarvardX, it's a de-identified data set where we used a K-anonymity of 5, and we picked a series of quasi-identifiers, some of which are obvious at things like your gender, and your year of birth, and your country. Another one that was really important was the number of forum posts that you have, since it would be very easy to go and scrape any forum to count the number of times you posted, and then if you're the only one who's in Introduction to Computer Science who's posted 49 times. So then, and here, I'll keep going on this because it's a rant and I'm learning a ton about it and really fascinated by it. So one of the things so why would you release an open data set? There are 2 reasons you would release an open data set. Number 1 is for replication purposes, to make it possible for other people to check your work and to improve transparency. The second one is to allow people to do novel analyses sort of in the spirit that the best thing to do with your data set is something that someone else is going to come up with. But the de-identification process, when we have cases where we don't have K-anonymity, there's 2 things that we can do to resolve that. We can either blur data, So we can take that person who is a Latvian and say that they're an Eastern European, or we can delete them, we can suppress them, we can get their record out of there, and I could describe exactly the ways in which we used both of those techniques. But we used both of those techniques in de-identifying the data set, and we ended up deleting 24% of the records that were in the data set. The original data set has 840,000 rows, the data set we released has 640,000 rows. In many of the characteristics, the results end up being pretty much the same. The proportion of students with a bachelor's degree in both data sets is pretty much identical. In some circumstances, they're very, very different. In the analyses that are already done, we can tell you exactly how different we think they should be. But of course, if we can tell you how different we think they should be, it's not clear sort of what the purposes of replication are from that context. And here's the super troubling thing. For any kind of novel analysis you would do with that data set, we wouldn't be able to tell you whether or not the finding that you have is because of a perturbation in the data that's due to de-identification, or because you found something super awesome that we didn't come up with. Now, in theory, if there were like 2 of you who went and played with the data and came back to us and said, hey, we think we found this thing, would you run it? We'd be like, yeah, sure. The 2 of you were happy to do that. If 1,000 people came back to it, and said, hey, there's a gazillion of us doing this, and we'd all like you to rerun, our code on your data, we'd, be like, actually, we have other things to do than having to do this wrong. And so, it's sort of hard to figure out how all that would work. So there's a whole bunch that I've just sort of packaged in there. I would say, what our team see, we're in the middle of writing an article for CACM that'll hopefully come out in the next couple of months, the communications with the Association of Computing Machine Learning. But for our point of view, what seems to be the real kind of underlying problem in this is that FERPA and most people conflate privacy with anonymity. They say that the way you make things private is to make them anonymous, but those 2 things don't have to be conflated. So the Federalist Papers were anonymous but not private. Your voting behavior is private but not anonymous. There are ways to decouple those 2 things. If we want to have a science of learning that's based on open data, it's not clear to me that we can use privacy strategies that are based on anonymity. So we might try some other strategies. Some would be technical implementations like differential privacy, where basically we start building systems where you can run your code on data sets that are protected behind firewalls, and you can get, certain kinds of data that come, certain kinds of findings that come back that'll be sort of pre-checked on their way back to make sure that they maintain some level of k-anonymity. But you're able to run your code on original data sets. That involves building a technological infrastructure that doesn't exist. The second possibility would be to rethink our notions of privacy to say, look, the techniques for anonymity we have now break the data, and it's not clear that they're going to work in the future anyway as people come up with new kinds of attacks. So why don't we work much harder on licensing the ways in which people are allowed to use data and circulate privately identifiable data, but circulate it in ways that the data is watermarked, and we can try to do some auditing and following up on people on how they're using it, instead of trying to use a set of de-identifying techniques that A, don't seem to work for the purposes that are intended, and B, seem to be sort of rapidly losing in an arms race between lots of other clever computer scientists who would like to go and break these techniques. So that was the 5-minute summary of Harvard and MIT and de-identified data.
So you said so many things there that are really interesting. One just reflection immediately was that you've actually dropped off some of this long tail, all these people that fell into the small groups, and that's really interesting when you think about diversity and wanting to embrace diversity and be able to understand and measure diverse, aspects that are related to these small populations that are, by definition, underrepresented.
You know one of the small populations in our courses? People who finish the course. That actually happens to be a group of people that we're super interested in. So in percentage point terms, in the original data set, about 5% of folks finished the course. In the de-identified data set, something like 2.76% of people finish the course. In percentage point terms, it's 2%. In percentage terms, we lost about half the people who completed the course. That's, very, very substantial. We also lost them at differential rates across our courses for reasons that we don't totally understand. There were some courses that lost 60% of their users. There's some courses that lost as few as 4% of their users. And for some of these things that we can explain, some of these things are totally lost to us. So yeah, it's a great point.
The question I had may have escaped me. Oh, it was about Latvia. It was about your discussion forums, because you used that as an example.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Latvia, blah, 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 blah. How did you deal with discussion forums? That's not, a cell data table that you can easily just say, oh, there were 5 people that said exactly, hi, I'm from Latvia.
Yeah, so
we
released only person-level summary statistics about our users. So the data set, we have at least hundreds of millions, probably billions of event logs of all of these folks. That's not what we released. We didn't even try to do that. We released what we call a person course data set, where each row of the data set corresponds to one registration for one person and a series of summary statistics. So we're already sort of binning and summarizing. We're not telling you every event. We're telling you that this person had 3,406 events in the system, or more commonly 2. And of course, it's again, the whole point is it's much easier to de-identify the people who have 2 events. Everyone who doesn't do anything is alike. Everyone who does something is different in their own particular way. And so, there's a great paper that John Darius took the lead on writing from MIT's institutional research. If you download the data set, there's a paper that describes sort of all of the steps that we took. And we're writing another paper where we're trying to describe some of the judgments that we made. Nerds will find this interesting, and others may as well. We actually we ended up really favoring suppression strategies. We favored strategies that deleted rows out of the data, because we decided, why don't we release data which is precise even if there's less of it. And then after we published that, we were like, oh man, maybe that's a terrible idea. Maybe we should have done more binning. Maybe we should have more rows where the data in the rows were more blurred. And we're just in the middle of doing this, but there seems to be some sense that when you blur the data set, you preserve more data, and any individual estimate is closest to the individual estimate that you would obtain that was sort of reported in the original data set. But after blurring, the correlations between different variables are further apart because you've reduced the variance by blurring it. And so the correlations that we report in the binned de-identified data set are further away from the original data set than the suppression-based data set. So essentially, there are a series of trade-offs, and we can sort of quantify for the analyses that we did that some have bigger benefit, some have benefits in some ways and some have benefits in others. But if anyone does any kind of novel analysis, we couldn't tell you whether or not what you're doing is a result of really clever analysis on your part, or you just found something because we deleted data in weird ways. It's something that's super troubling, but and fascinating if you're me. Maybe while my slide is up here, maybe I'll make one other pitch. So my plug would be, I think even if we have the broad sense that students trust us and the public trust us, I think the capacity for us to very rapidly lose that trust and very rapidly generate public outrage is very high. So folks who are from the United States might have been following the effort that was funded by the Gates Foundation to create this organization called InBloom, which would be a non-profit third-party clearinghouse for data sharing. The alternative to InBloom was basically that Pearson was going to collect all this stuff, and InBloom, for all of its problems, may have in fact been a better idea than that. But student privacy advocates were very successful at lobbying their legislatures and district officials to withdraw support for it. I think what we're seeing in the last couple of days with the Facebook contagion experiment, I think the stuff that Facebook has reported doing in the past is much creepier than what they reported this time. And the stuff that they did with voting manipulation is super concerning to me. Showing people slightly happier or slightly sadder things that could also be concerning. But messing with our democracy is a pretty big deal. My own hunch is that the Snowden revelations have definitely changed the context of all this. The idea that we know for sure that the government is taking large amounts of this data and using it for purposes that we didn't anticipate means that the sort of power baked into the collection of these data sets is much more significant. So I think K-12 education, I think higher education should be at the forefront of these conversations and should not be sweeping them aside, but should be trying to have them and trying to develop principles and guidelines for ethical research and data collection and be in front of the public and letting them know that they should be able to trust us because we're thinking about these things, we're thinking about our relationship with commercial providers, and we're intensely engaged in these important conversations. There was a group of about 50 folks. Zach was one of them. There may be other people who are here who met at Asilomar State Park in California at the beginning of June. to release a document that was called the Asilomar Convention, which was trying to revisit some of the issues raised by the Belmont Report and by FERPA and by other kinds of things, and start a conversation, which we hope many other people will participate in, about, most of the guidelines we have were written, primarily with, especially on the sort of research side, they were written with biomedical research in mind for an analog world. And most of us are doing learning research in a digital world, and they're probably substantially different contexts, and certainly the context in which FERPA was written is totally different than the one that we're in now. The Department of Education on their own is not going to come up with the best solutions to these things. They really need us to be in conversation. It's not clear how these conversations are supposed to happen or who's in charge of them. Yesterday at the Berkman Center, after the Facebook privacy revelations, just a bunch of folks got together and said, as social scientists, we need to do something. Let's figure out what kinds of conversations we ought to be having and start having them. And I think it would be great if other people in other places were doing that as well. I think one way to maintain the public trust that we've discussed that we have is to make it very clear to the public that we're proactively reconsidering all the decisions that we're making around the collection of student data and how we're using it all the time. And that even though we know that people trust us now, we take that trust really seriously and we maintain that trust by being proactive in protecting it. That's my slash soapbox.
No, I agree, and we'll just put in a plug for inviting all of you to please continue this conversation, this set of conversations with us. And I think there's a slide up there that shows kind of how you can track us down. The Student Privacy Initiative at Berkman has hosted some gatherings on this. We released a paper back about a month ago, Framing the Law and Policy Picture, Snapshot of K-12 Cloud-Based EdTech and Student Privacy in early 2014. That's available on our website. That gives some pragmatic guidance, largely directed at policymakers, for where we kind of stand right now, since it's a rapidly evolving landscape. We have a number of other documents up there, including a very handy-dandy guide to COPA and FERPA. That was released in November of 2013, so for folks who wanted to hear more about those acronyms, you can find that there. And also, I'm Leah Plunkett, this is Justin and Paulina, and our contact information will be up there as well. And please continue the dialogue.
I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about your work, Justin.
No, I work at HarvardX. You can find it. If anybody's coming on the tour at 4:30, I'll walk around with you and show you HarvardX and talk to you more about it. Great stuff too.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you very much. This is a lot of fun.